Hey friends, it's Dan here with the Grace People podcast, and we have a special episode. We've got Mara and Bruce from Ox and Crow Coffee. Now, we had their episode, they were on episode 3, and we had a bonus conversation that I'm finally getting around to posting that talks about all kinds of cool coffee things, telling you the difference between what is first, second, and third wave coffee, what's the difference between roasts, what is a natural process, a honey process, washed, what does any of that mean, why is it important, and how can it improve your coffee experience? Well, guess what? Bruce is here to talk about all of that with you. So it's like you have your own personal tour guide. So check this out. I know you're going to love it. I already love it. You will too. All right, here we go. Special bonus episode 1 of the Grace People podcast. Let's talk a little bit about coffee for those. We're hit some things that people might not know about. They know about coffee. They've been drinking Folgers their whole life. They've maybe even gone to Starbucks. They may not have branched out further than that. So let's start with, you mentioned the third wave coffee. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, that would just be what does that even mean? So can you give us a simple walkthrough of what third wave coffee is and where does it come from?
Right. I don't know how the terms were coined, but I do know that. So in my mom's day, for example, she would. And this is where I fell in love with the idea of having people over for coffee, because my mom was a stay-at-home mom that raised 5 boys, and they were almost all the moms in the neighborhood stayed home, and they would congregate at one of the people's houses, and they would have coffee, and we would put, my mom would put coffee in a percolator on the stovetop and percolate the coffee, and she would make, a coffee cake to share with her friends, and she invited them over at a certain time. Everybody came over, and they talked about the challenges of raising a family and school, and they talked about fun things and vacations, and you got to catch up on what everybody else was doing. And when I was very young, I would always like to sneak up and listen in on what they were talking about, right? But I do remember seeing that. I was fascinated by that coffee on the stove, but the coffee that they put in there was Folgers or MJB or Maxwell House. And so they were taking coffee.
Good to the last drop.
Yeah, good to the last. Yeah, we know all the jingles and everything. And Mara will always go over some of those. But, that coffee was produced by, these huge production facilities. And the equipment that they use, they would freeze dry the coffee. And so in doing so, they really took the flavor out of the coffee. So it was coffee, but it wasn't as nature intended you to enjoy it. So most of the coffee went out through their process.
When you see as nature intended, you mean as an IV.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
That's what I'm pretty sure nature intended.
Hang a bag and walk around with my little IV of coffee. Yes, and that's the way nature's intended it.
So we've got this black ground freeze-dried powder that's ended up in a can and sent to us.
Yeah, and it was most likely produced, for a long time. And that's really considered the first wave of coffee. And then, the companies like Starbucks and Caribou, the more commercial side of things, found out that we were losing a lot of the flavor of coffee. So they decided to, it's still a very large production facility, obviously with Starbucks, but it didn't start out that way. But they decided to get coffee directly from coffee farms and roast it and have a coffee shop. And it started in Seattle for Starbucks, and Caribou started here in Minneapolis, and they were doing their own roasting, and they were retaining a lot of this flavor. And people would walk in and say, well, that doesn't taste like my MJB.
That doesn't taste like coffee.
That doesn't taste like coffee. This is a whole new world to me. So that became known as the second wave of coffee. And then there were people very much like myself, entrepreneurs that thought, I've had Starbucks coffee and Caribou coffee. I wonder if I could do that. If I studied how to do that and the science behind it, maybe I would be able to do that. And what I like about a coffee shop is that it feels like home, and it feels kind of like a cafe, or there was something that you were trying to get out of it, and maybe you didn't get that at the Starbucks in the Mall of America, right? You didn't get that feeling. It was too commercial, maybe too big or too busy. Maybe it didn't have that home feel that you were looking for. So these entrepreneurs decided that they were going to do that for themselves, and that's become what they call the third wave coffee shop.
More small batch artisan specialty coffee.
So you think about like what we did when we had the brick and mortar Ox and Crow Coffee House with the roastery. We were roasting our own coffee. We were in control of the quality of our coffee, when it was roasted, how long it rested before it hit the shelf. You could buy a bag of it and know that it was probably roasted within that week and it was fresh. And I once had a person in the coffee industry tell me, 75% of a coffee's flavor is due to the fact that it's fresh roasted. Before you even talk about profiles or this or dark roast or medium roast or any of these other things, it just needs to be fresh. And that's 75% of the flavor. And then, there was the other fractions included the water quality, and then the processing methods, and then the roasting method. So really, it seems rather mysterious, and that's due to people like us, that we don't want to share our profiles about how we roast this coffee or that coffee. But it's not really super complicated. I know that if I showed you a few simple things, you could do it. What's holding people back is the capital necessary to buy the equipment. The coffee roasting equipment's expensive, and then you need a grind. It's like that story: if you give a mouse a cookie,
That was me like 3 years ago. It was like, okay, my friend made these these ceramic pour overs, and so I was like, all right, I need pour over. I'm like, now I need these filters. Now I need the grinder. Now I need the good coffee. It's like, well, now I need a sweet mug to put it in. It's just like all the.
Now I need a scale.
It's like now I need a scale. Now I need a filter. Now I like a water filter. Absolutely.
So you can feel like a little bit overwhelmed with all of that, but those were the waves that went through the coffee industry. So right now we're kind of at the end of the third wave, and they've talked about, well, what's next, and so I think there was some talk about coffee infused beverages, and
there's a lot of coffee beers.
Coffee beers.
I saw another one today. I'm just totally blanking. I was on Instagram, and another Minneapolis brewery had paired up with a Minneapolis coffee roaster, and had their coffee ale. And it was like, okay, there's another one of those. So that's happening. You see the hard coffee in cans. I think Black Eye. I'm having so many brain farts right now. This is why I need the coffee. It's inspiring, but
it might be Black Eye, right?
Yeah, and there are so many. I don't think people notice. Like they don't know. Would never realize there are probably 25 or so Twin Cities coffee roasters on the list that I've been keeping.
Oh wow!
Which is just unbelievable that so many people are doing it. So all that to say, you guys are doing an awesome job doing that.
Thank you.
Now, for the normal coffee buyer, they're excited now. They're like, okay, I've heard this podcast and I want to go buy some coffee from Ox and Crow. And they get there and they're like, okay, what's the difference? What's even a light, a medium, a dark roast? Now you're telling me also there's different processes. Let's start with the light to dark roast. Real simply, just describe that.
Yeah. So at a really high level, coffee roasting is broken down into 3 stages. And these stages aren't discrete. It's not like it starts and stops at a very specific temperature. It's a continuum of this entire process, but roughly speaking, it's broken down into 3 stages. The first stage is a drying phase. The middle stage is a browning stage, and then the last stage is called a development stage, is really where the flavors are developed. So when you talk about a light or roast versus a dark roast, that usually takes place in that last stage. So it's determinant on how long the coffee spends in the roaster at that last development stage, and also the temperature at which you take that coffee to. So in the roaster, we can control the process through all the knobs and the Wizard of Oz sort of stuff that goes on there. And so for a light roast, I would spend less time in the roaster at the end, but I'd also control the roast in a way that I would drop the coffee out of the roaster at a lower temperature. And so the result of that is that the bean is more cinnamon colored and less darker colored. And you'll know that's how you kind of determine what becomes a light roast or a medium roast and what becomes a dark roast.
I think when people often open up a can of, like we were talking about, the Folgers or something, you're used to like a dark chocolate sort of brown or black.
Right. It was
like
black.
Cafe Bustelo,
Yeah,
which is
right.
what my parents, had me. That's what was in our house. It was just black powder.
Yeah.
It's like gunpowder.
Gunpowder.
Might as
Yeah.
well be.
Yeah. And so our philosophy is, find out what coffee you like and then drink that, and so there's a big knock on coffee roasters because a lot of people feel like they have to drink the coffee that they should like, not the coffee that they actually like.
Oh,
and we don't
interesting.
believe that at Ox and Crow. We say, find the coffee that you like and then drink that. And what we don't have any pretensions. Mara and I, personally, we prefer a more lighter to medium roasted coffee. The flavor profiles that you get are more. You can taste more nuances in the coffee depending on the origin or the harvest conditions or all these other unique factors. We talked earlier about that cultivar, Pink Bourbon. And so it has a very unique
right here.
flavor profile.
Yeah, it says caramelized sugar, cocoa, and tart fruit acidity. So if somebody reading this who isn't used to like flavor notes or profiles might think, so is this like a flavored coffee? Did you add caramelized sugar and cocoa and fruit? Like what is...
Yeah.
So what's actually, how would you correct or maybe not correct, that's a little strong. How would you educate a person who would say that or ask that?
Those kind of tasting notes are standard to the industry, and they actually have something called a flavor wheel, and they've characterized through very strict testing different flavors that coffee can take on. Some of them are very pleasant, like the ones that you just read aloud on the bag. And there are others that are unpleasant.
What would be an example of an unpleasant?
Avoid
Like
ash, cigarette, tobacco,
tires.
Tires, burnt tire. They're phenolic. There's a roast defect that cause you to taste phenolic, and somebody would go, "Well, I'm not a chemist. I don't know what phenolic tastes like." Well, take a pack of Band-Aids and open up a Band-Aid, and what you smell as the Johnson & Johnson Band-Aid, that's phenolic smell. So it's not pleasant. It's not something that you would want to taste. It's or bitterness, is another coffee quality, and it's all coffee has some sense of bitterness to it. But what we try to do when we roast is put it into balance with the other flavors, like what we just talked about. The danger in all this is that when I describe the flavor notes, they're very subtle, and they're it's just like wine tasting. And these subtle flavor notes, people get scared. They say, "Well, I don't like sweet." Coffee. When we say a coffee is sweet, it's not sugar sweet like a can of Coca-Cola. It's a subtle sweetness that's in balance with the other notes in the coffee. So it doesn't mean that it tastes like you poured a teaspoon of sugar in there. And so that becomes really hard to overcome. And so I guess what I would say to a new person that's just starting this is don't be afraid. Like you're not going to get harmed by having this coffee, and experience what this would be. Taste it. Right. It's easy to say, well, I don't like that. And then you will say, well, have you tasted this coffee before? And then if they say no, then I think the rebuttal should be, well, you should try it. And then if you don't like it, then you can say, I tasted it, I don't like it, and I'd like to move on to I would like to try something else. And so, that whole process that we've talked about, that's where, as a coffee roaster, we're in control of that. Like, how do we accentuate those flavor profiles? And these coffees, for example, an Ethiopian coffee is the oldest, coffee plants in the world.
Birthplace of coffee.
The birthplace of
Ethiopia.
Coffee. And the flavors that come out of the coffees from Ethiopia are unique. And, when you taste that, it's very subtle. And as a roaster, it's hard to bring out that subtlety in the flavor profile of the cup that you're shooting for. And that's what takes effort and practice. And
how do you even know what you're shooting for when you start roasting a certain bean?
That's where we partner with like the importer of that coffee. And so in our case, we work with a company in Minneapolis. The name of the company is Cafe Imports. They're a really famous coffee importer. They just so happen to have a warehouse in Minneapolis where they store coffee, so it's really easy to get. They have graders of the coffee at that warehouse because it's their business. They have to import, and they want to import coffees that they think they can sell based on the taste and the flavor of the coffee. And so they're highly trained people. So think of in wine, you have sommeliers. Well, you have in coffee, you have people called Q graders, and they grade the coffee based on samples that they roast and then taste. And based on that Q score, that's how the price gets determined for that coffee. And that Q, it's not one person saying this is the score of the coffee. It's actually like a round robin table of people. It can be up to 4 or 6 Q graders that they all taste the same coffee at the same time, and they grade it. And then after it gets graded, then they
talk about it.
And what
notes.
flavors
like a judges
did you,
panel.
So then it's kind of like a judges panel. But these are professionals, and they've been trained in sensory analysis is really what it is, and that using that flavor wheel that we've talked about, and they come up with these profiles. And so when they sell me the coffee, it's my job as a roaster to see if I can, coax out those flavor profiles by roasting it properly.
And you're trusting that them as the Q graders are telling you this is what. Given if you were to do this at its best, you could coax some of these flavors out of this. Nuances.
And so let's say, for example, that Cafe Imports had bad Q graders and they couldn't grade, very well. Then their livelihood as a business would be, at stake. And so they spend a lot of effort and money and making sure they retain talent of their tasters. And they're all over the world. They're in every coffee origin in the world, tasting coffees all the time. Even in the age of COVID, they're still there doing it. It's more restrictions, but they're still there tasting coffee and buying coffee. So that's part of it. And then, we talked about the roasting and the profile and how you develop that coffee is super important. Because, as a roaster, I can really screw that up by doing it wrong. And so that comes with a lot of practice and, tasting it and saying, it's not quite there. I need to do something else. And so you go back and you look at your profile and you kind of determine where in the profile you feel like you can make a change that would help you accentuate that. If you like darker coffees, you're going to taste less of those notes. It moves more to chocolate and nut. And then it moves to more the really heavily roasted,
French
coffees.
roast.
French roasts they're bordering on ash and really burnt flavors.
It just tastes like the people who want coffee that tastes like coffee.
Right?
Go for a dark,
dark roast.
We've
We've been and Starbucks is genius at this, right? Because now they've taken an entire population and really calibrated their tasting to a dark coffee, and to their favor. So we as coffee roasters fight that, every day, because people think that's how coffee should taste, like my Starbucks dark roast.
That's interesting. And I was won over to coffee it was maybe 8 years ago. It was a cup of Up Roasters from Minneapolis, and my buddy had it, and he was like, "You got to try this," and he was like passing it around the circle, and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, that's so good!" And I was like, I was the I don't like coffee guy, and I tasted it, and I was just like, everyone was like, "Whoa, oh my gosh, that's so good!" And I was like, "This tastes like tea."
Yeah.
It doesn't taste like coffee. This tastes like I'm drinking tea. What in the world is going on here?
Yeah.
So different with the different processes. Briefly, just because for time's sake, there are different processes like honey, washed, natural process. I don't even know if it's possible to give a succinct description of what's going on there, but can you try to describe that?
Yeah. So I think that the processes that you were talking about happen at origin, when the coffee is being produced by the farmer. And so the coffee beans themselves aren't actually beans, they're the seeds of a coffee cherry. So the coffee plant, let's just say, for example, the cultivar Pink Bourbon has a pink fruit that is, when it's ripe, it's pink in color. And when it's harvested, then it has that fruit on the outside. And so a washed coffee, the fruit will be removed in the first process. Then the bean will go through a fermentation process to remove the mucilage and the other material that are around the coffee beans or the coffee seeds. And then after that, that fermentation process, they're washed and then they're racked and dried. And when that coffee comes to you, it's to a coffee roaster, it's a green. It looks almost emerald green, like the color of Mara's shirt here. And those of you on the podcast probably can't see it, but it's just like more of an emerald green color. And that's a typical washed coffee process. And then you have a honey processed coffee where the fruit is removed, and that sticky mucilage, instead of going through the fermentation and washing process, it's left on and it's dried with that sticky mucilage on the outside of the coffee seed. And then it's sent to us in that manner after it's dried. And it retains some of the fruit qualities of that cup. And it's truly unique. It's the kind of a wave that's going through coffee roasting right now, is the honey processes are becoming really popular with coffee drinkers. And the natural coffees, the coffee cherry, and the fruit is left on the coffee seeds. And so it's not removed, and it's dried in that manner. And that process is a little riskier because you can get, bacteria growth in your beds and that sort of thing. So you have to be cognizant of that. So that drying process is a lot more important. But it's dried with the fruit on the coffee seed. And then later that's removed and sent to you. But that coffee the profiles of that is for sure a more fruitier flavor in the cup. And that's, again, it's really popular amongst coffee drinkers, who consider themselves, connoisseurs of coffee, and they're really shooting for, different. They might blend it with a washed coffee, and so you get a hint of that fruitiness and that sort of thing. Or if you've ever had it in an espresso, like I've had it in an espresso, and I can taste it like right away. I'll say they're using a natural in their espresso blend, and I can taste it. I don't know what they're actually using unless they tell me, but I can always taste that flavor profile right away. So those are the main processes that happen at origin. That and like I said before, we have this belief is like, try it, see if you might like that, and the philosophy at our shop also, when you come in, is we'll brew you up some. We we say try before you buy, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you come to the coffee roastery and we're there, we'll brew some up and you can taste it and you can say, wow, I really like that, or no, I don't like that. It's too sweet. Like we had a person that came in and they tried that pink bourbon from Colombia, and they were like just blown away by the flavor profiles. And they said, usually when you say, you've had that experience where a wine person might say, oh, I pick up, notes of blackberry and, volcanic ash and the tannins. And, you're just like, I don't get that, right? But the person that came in and had it, they said, man, you hit those flavor notes. I tasted every one of them, And so that's why, like I said, that's what we're shooting for, that kind of feedback from somebody who's just really interested in tasting that. That's what we're looking for as feedback for a coffee roaster. And I think, when we talked earlier about light versus dark, your chances of hitting those notes are much higher when it's light, and it goes away as you move towards the darker roasts. It's just becomes more, monotonal in terms of the flavor profiles. And the darker you get. And that, honestly, I'll share this one experience. That's what drove us to want to roast our own coffee, because when we were going to Starbucks, they would say, well, here, try this Komodo Dragon, dark roast. And then they said, tomorrow we'll have this blonde roast was on. And we started to say, I don't taste the difference between that one and that one, And so we were saying, does coffee really have something to offer that's different? Because these are two origins, and yet then they were roasted differently, but yet they tasted the same to me, or it was starting to taste the same to me. So that's when we decided to try it ourselves, and we didn't want to make a big investment. So we went to Goodwill and we found a popcorn popper.
Yeah, I've heard that's you can buy these little air poppers or whatever that'll get you started.
Yeah.
And I bought books, and I had been reading about coffee roasting in these books, and I knew the process, and so we had a timer, we had a scale, and we had this popcorn popper. And you should have seen us running in and out. The first batch we tried to do in the house, and the whole house smelled like smoked coffee for
burnt
for weeks.
Toast,
burnt toast for weeks.
I taste the burnt toast.
You can't do this anymore.
That's what it was. We just burned the heck out of it.
So then we sat out in the backyard, and we're doing it on our deck in the middle of winter with the snow, and the chaff is coming off. We got mittens and oh my gosh, it was just a show.
This might be my new quarantine activity.
Yeah.
We knew we could roast
winter.
better coffee in our little popcorn popper than we could get anywhere nearby, So we were like, let's do it.
So then we started having troubles controlling the roast. We figured out we had troubles controlling the roast with this popcorn popper. It would just cook it too fast, And so we slowed it down. We said, well, what could we do? So we took that drying phase and we did it in the oven. We just set the oven to bake, and when it got up to, I can't remember what temperature we used at first, 4 something, and we dried the coffee we tried to shoot for a drying time of 5 to 7 minutes, somewhere in that range. And then we would dry. We knew the coffee was dry because the bean would turn from that emerald green color to a yellow color.
Okay.
And that's the visualization that you need to know that coffee's moving into that next phase of browning, right? So we would dry it in the oven, then we would transfer it to the popcorn popper really quick. And Mara was super quick at doing it because I just made her do it all the time. And she would never spill a bean. She would just get all the beans in the popcorn popper. And then I would take the popcorn popper, and then I started to run outside, and I would start to agitate it by just moving it back and forth. I'd slosh the coffee. So I'd turn it on its side and slosh it back and forth. And then all of a sudden, we started making coffee we were like, hey,
wow,
this tastes pretty good.
We're doing it, Derry.
And we were buying our coffee from, we were paying $7, $8 a pound green from Sweet Maria's. And it was super interesting to get started that way. It was very humbling, and we just kind of thought, hey, we're making pretty good coffee doing this really crudely. I wonder what we could do if we had a halfway decent roaster, and that was boom.
And you jumped into the roaster.
Yeah, that was the start of it. I mean, it wasn't like immediate. You know, we had to save up money and all the other stuff. So
that's super fun.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that and all of those stories.
Yeah.
You said this wasn't going to be his thing, talking. This is great. This is awesome.
Well, he said that.
Well, no,
Somebody said something.
Mara's more of
I love. Well, you have the
the technical side.
the technical side,
Yeah.
which I think is just, and he can explain it in a way that's I think
it's so easy to follow.
understand and follow. Yeah, yeah. Our goal, Dan, in the near future is to start offering coffee education classes, kind of like what we've talked about here, but small group, 6 people, and in our roastery, and do some tastings and do some side by sides, and look at the roaster, look at the profiles. What is it? What are we looking for? The classes could be origin classes, or the history of coffee, and just a variety of different things that we think would be really fun, because I think there is a keen interest in that. Just learning that little bit of what we've actually just talked about here today, and so we're excited to kind of offer that in the roastery in probably this winter sometime. That people will be ready to get out. And
a Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
For the coffee lover in your life, bring them on this romantic tasting.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's what you want to do at night, is taste a bunch of coffees. Maybe on the weekend or something.
Yeah, we've talked about that before.
I mostly say this so I can convince my wife to take me to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it would be really fun. We're really excited
with
to.
food or chocolate.
Or chocolate, or
And I think there's, with our direct trade partners at Finca Torito, there's this whole side of the coffee producing education that people would get to see. So all those things that I just described, they would have videos. They've already offered to us, like, we'll do whatever you want. If you want to plan an origin trip of interested people, you can come down and see the farm in Honduras. Like right now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but like
in a few years,
in a few years, that might be a real viable thing that some people that are really geeked out about it might really enjoy. And it's a beautiful place.
Very possible to find those people who'd be interested in the 11th best coffee city in the U.S.
Right.
Yeah. I think there would be some good interest. So, and nobody's doing it. I'm sure the other roasters maybe did it in their early days too. And and actually, I shouldn't say nobody's doing it. I'm sure people are. We just in our side of town, there's the roasters of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but there are no other independent roasters on this side of town per se. So, I think it'd be something fun for people to do. So.
That's great.
Yeah. So, thank you so very much for having us.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for being here.
For inviting us. And
I've learned so much.
Yeah, thanks.